Most people believe they know what ordinary people ate before modern food. Bread, soup, maybe porridge. Something simple, brown, and vaguely virtuous. The sort of diet that appears in museum illustrations and school textbooks, where everyone looks thin, tired, and strangely well-behaved. This understanding feels solid because it is partly true. Ordinary people did eat bread. They did rely on grains. They did repeat meals until novelty disappeared as a concept. But this confidence rests on a quiet assumption that food, in the past, was simpler because life was simpler, and that simplicity, while harsh, was at least honest. That assumption is incomplete. If you lived before modern food systems, what you ate was not defined by tradition or taste, but by exposure to risk. Not the dramatic kind, the slow kind, the kind that accumulates invisibly and only announces itself when something finally breaks. Here is an unsettling question that people rarely ask. If pre-modern diets were so natural, why did so many societies spend so much time trying to stop people from starving, even in years when crops technically existed? The familiar image is a loaf of bread on a wooden table. The less familiar reality is that this loaf was not a stable object. It was a negotiation between weather and storage, between landlords and tenants, between soil exhaustion and human endurance. When we say bread, we imagine a category. In practice, bread was a moving target. It changed year to year, region to region, household to household. Sometimes it was wheat, sometimes rye, sometimes barley, sometimes whatever plant had survived long enough to be ground into something that could pass as flour without killing you immediately, and sometimes it wasn't really bread at all. Historical records are full of substitutions that don't appear in popular memory. Ground peas, acorns, bark, chestnuts, dried roots. Not as emergency measures, but as recurring features of ordinary diets, not because people misunderstood nutrition, but because the system they lived inside made these choices reasonable. Food, before modern supply chains, was not about nourishment in the abstract. It was about continuity, about eating something today that did not make tomorrow impossible. This is the first contradiction worth sitting with. Ordinary diets were repetitive, not because people valued tradition, but because repetition was the safest option available in an environment where novelty carried consequences. The past did not lack variety out of ignorance. It avoided variety out of caution, and even then, caution often failed. Because what people ate was never just about what grew nearby. It was about who controlled storage, who set rents, who claimed surplus, and who absorbed loss when the system misfired. The food itself was only the surface. The machinery behind it was already in motion. To understand what ordinary people ate, it helps to stop thinking about meals and start thinking about timing. Food before modernity was less a daily routine than a long logistical problem stretched across an entire year. Harvests happened once. Hunger happened continuously. Everything in between was a test of whether the system could slow decay faster than mouths consumed reserves. Grain mattered not because it tasted good, but because it could wait. This is where the story usually becomes romantic. Stone mills, communal ovens, seasonal rhythms. But the more important development was quieter. Storage became power. Whoever controlled the granary controlled the calendar. They decided when abundance officially ended and scarcity officially began. For ordinary people, eating meant aligning themselves with this calendar, even when it drifted away from reality. Grain could exist in storage while people went hungry. This was not a paradox. It was a feature. Consider the misunderstood concept of subsistence. It sounds like a nutritional threshold, but it functioned more like a margin of error. Subsistence meant eating just enough that you could keep working without collapsing, while leaving enough surplus above you to satisfy rent, taxes, tithes, and seed for next year. Falling below subsistence didn't mean immediate death. It meant entering a zone where small disruptions became catastrophic. This is why ordinary diets appear monotonous. Not because people lacked imagination, but because predictability minimized loss. The same gruel, the same bread, the same thin beer. These weren't cultural preferences. They were accounting decisions made with the body. Even protein followed this logic. Meat existed, but it circulated socially rather than nutritionally. It appeared at festivals, holidays, or after an animal had already served its primary purpose. Chickens laid eggs before they became food. Cows worked before they were eaten. Livestock was a form of stored value that only converted into calories when its economic function was exhausted. Vegetables, often assumed to be abundant, were similarly constrained. Many spoiled quickly. Others required fuel to cook safely. Raw produce was risky in a world without reliable sanitation. The safest foods were those that had already been transformed, fermented, dried, boiled, or baked beyond recognition. At no point was the question, what is healthiest? The question was, what will still exist in 6 months? And will it kill fewer people than the alternatives? From this perspective, the ordinary diet was not poor. It was optimized for survival inside fragile systems with narrow tolerances, which is why it collapsed so easily. Because optimization removes slack, and slack is what absorbs shock. The system worked as long as weather behaved. Rulers restrained extraction and storage held. When any one of those variables shifted, the diet did not gradually worsen. It failed abruptly. People didn't starve because they ate badly. They starved because the margin disappeared, and the margin was never theirs to begin with. When pre-modern food systems failed, the explanation rarely pointed upward. Failure was attributed to poor choices, laziness, gluttony, or divine displeasure. Diet became a moral story because moral stories are easier to manage than structural ones. If hunger was caused by sin or ignorance, then the system itself remained sound. This is where one of history's quieter distortions appears. Ordinary people were often accused of eating the wrong foods during crises, mixing flours, stretching grain with substitutes, consuming things not meant to be eaten. These behaviors were framed as desperation or ignorance. In reality, they were rational adaptations within a collapsing system. When grain prices rose, people diluted bread, not because they misunderstood bread, but because bread was no longer functioning as a stable unit of calories. The loaf had become smaller, darker, heavier, with fiber and indigestible matter. It filled the stomach while delivering less energy, which prolonged labor capacity just enough to delay collapse. This created a feedback loop. Weakened bodies produced less work reduced income. Reduced income narrowed food options further. The diet didn't cause the weakness. It recorded it. Authorities often responded by regulating food itself, setting bread standards, banning substitutes, policing markets. On paper, this looked like protection. In practice, it criminalized adaptation. The system punished people for making the only decisions available to them. Here is the unsettling part. Many of these regulations were technically correct. Adulterated bread was dangerous. Spoiled grain caused illness. Unfamiliar plants carried toxins. The problem was that safety required surplus, and surplus had already been extracted. The food became unsafe because the system had already failed. Regulating it addressed the symptom while preserving the cause. This pattern repeats across regions and centuries. When diets deteriorated, the response was not to question rents, taxes, or storage control, but to lecture people on proper eating. The narrative of simple, wholesome food hardened precisely when food was becoming neither simple nor wholesome. What we remember as a rustic diet was often a late-stage artifact, what remained after options had narrowed. And yet the system endured for centuries, not because it was humane, but because it distributed suffering slowly. Most years were not famine years. They were years of quiet malnutrition, where people survived, reproduced, and worked while carrying deficits forward. This endurance is often mistaken for stability. It wasn't stable. It was absorbent. The human body was the shock absorber. It compensated for shortages by shrinking expectations. Shorter stature, lower energy, delayed development. These weren't cultural traits. They were physiological adjustments to long-term constraint. So when collapse came, through war, climate shifts, disease, or intensified extraction, it felt sudden only to those reading backward. In real time, it was the predictable endpoint of a system that had been consuming its buffers for generations. Food did not fail people. Food revealed what had already been taken. The transformation of ordinary diets did not begin with abundance. It began with control. What changed was not what people knew about food, but how uncertainty was managed. The old system accepted volatility and forced bodies to adapt. The new system attempted to eliminate volatility by reorganizing production, storage, and distribution, often at enormous human cost elsewhere. Before this shift, hunger was local and frequent. After it, hunger became distant and abstract. This is where the story becomes uncomfortable for modern nostalgia. The improvement in ordinary diets did not arrive as a moral awakening or a nutritional breakthrough. It arrived when states and markets realized that instability was expensive. Standing armies required predictable calories. Urban labor required consistent energy. Tax systems required populations that survived long enough to pay repeatedly. The solution was not better food in isolation, but systems that smoothed supply across space and time. Grain moved farther. Storage scaled up. Risk was externalized. If one region failed, another compensated. Ordinary people ate more consistently not because they were valued, but because their consistency became useful. This is also when food became standardized. Standardization removed the visible signs of scarcity. Bread looked the same even when conditions differed. Diets appeared stable even when the costs were displaced. To colonies, to plantations, to ecosystems, to future soil. What had once been an honest negotiation with limits became an illusion of permanence. And this is where the familiar narrative quietly flips. The pre-modern diet is often praised for being unprocessed, while modern food is blamed for abstraction and distance. But the older system was already abstract. Most people did not eat from ecosystems they controlled. They ate from systems that managed scarcity by rationing exposure to risk. The difference is scale, not principle. The ordinary person in the past ate food shaped by landlords, climate, and storage constraints. The ordinary person today eats food shaped by logistics, energy markets, and global incentives. In both cases, the diet makes sense inside the system that produces it. What changed is who absorbs failure. When the old system failed, hunger was immediate and visible. When the modern system strains, the effects arrive as chronic disease, environmental degradation, and fragile dependencies that feel normal until they aren't. This is why looking backward can feel comforting. The past looks honest, because its suffering was explicit. Ours is delayed, distributed, and politely labeled, which brings us back to the original belief that ordinary people once ate simply, naturally, and well. They didn't. They ate defensively. They ate cautiously. They ate within systems that asked their bodies to compensate for structural decisions they did not make. And those systems did not disappear. They learned to hide. The persistence of this misunderstanding is not accidental. We like to imagine past diets as pure because it allows us to locate modern problems in modern choices. If people once ate correctly and now eat poorly, then the solution is individual correction. Eat better. Choose wisely. Return to basics. This framing is tidy. It is also historically illiterate. Ordinary diets have always been shaped less by knowledge than by constraint. What changes across history is not human wisdom, but which constraints are visible and which are disguised as normal. In the past, food scarcity announced itself loudly. Failed harvests had names. Hunger had seasons. Bodies showed the cost early and often. Today, the system is quieter. Calories are abundant, while nourishment becomes conditional. The consequences accumulate slowly, then appear as personal failure. The pattern is familiar. Systems optimize for efficiency. Efficiency removes buffers. Buffers absorb shocks. When shocks arrive, the cost is assigned downward. The diet reflects this assignment long before it becomes a crisis. Seen this way, the question, "What did ordinary people eat before modern food?" misses the point slightly. The more revealing question is, what risks were ordinary people expected to absorb through their bodies? The answer, historically, is most of them. They absorbed weather variability through hunger. They absorbed economic extraction through stunted growth. They absorbed storage failures through disease. Their diets were not cultural artifacts so much as survival records. This is why the story feels unsettling when examined closely. It suggests continuity where we expect rupture. It suggests that improvement in food has less to do with enlightenment than with reorganized incentives. And it suggests that whenever a system claims stability, someone else is likely paying to maintain the appearance. The past does not offer a model to return to. It offers a warning pattern, not that food systems fail, but that they fail quietly, long before anyone agrees they have failed. And when we finally notice, we tend to blame the food because it is easier than naming the machinery that produced it. The ordinary person has always eaten at the edge of what the system could tolerate. The edge simply moves, and it rarely announces itself until it's already behind us.